Good morning, friends. We had started a discussion on DGPSI principles sometime back in the Naavi Academy and covered a few of the principles, but we could not complete that series in the same sequence. So today we will cover the DGPSI principles uh, together, all the 12 principles. And in a subsequent video, we will also introduce an extension to DGPSI, which is in the form of DGPSI-AI. Okay, so before we get into DGPSI-AI, let us recall our discussions on DGPSI principles. As you are aware, DGPSI is Data Governance and Protection Standard of India. This is a framework for the purpose of compliance to the Indian Data Protection Act called Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023 or DPDPA 2023. When we released DGPSI as a full version, we covered not only DPDPA but also the requirements of ITA 2000, Information Technology Act 2000, to the extent it refers to the personal data protection. We also covered the principles of data protection, personal data protection, in the draft requirements which the Bureau of Indian Standards had published for data governance and data protection. So DGPSI full is a compliance document which covers both the DPDPA and ITA 2000 and also the draft BIS standards. Now, to make things easy for smaller companies, we also introduced a later version of DGPSI. We call it as DGPSI Lite. And in this DGPSI Lite, we covered 36 implementation specifications as compared to 50 implementation specifications in the full version. And these 36 implementation specifications were directly related to the requirements of DPDPA 2023 as a law. Now, as we have emphasized several times, compliance to a law requires close association with what is provided in the law. And we cannot take too much of liberties when we design the detailed implementation specifications. It has to actually meet the requirements of the law. Therefore, DGPSI Lite actually is something which directly correlates with the different sections of the DPDPA 2023. Now, both this DGPSI full version and light version were based on some foundation principles, and that was what we called as DGPSI principles. We will try to quickly run through these principles. In today's presentation, we are not going into the implementation specifications of the DGPSI. We will take it up in a different session, but we will only cover the DGPSI principles. The very first principle, which was embedded in the DGPSI, is to consider an organization which is processing what we call as DPD or the DPDPA protected personal data. What I mean by DPDPA protected personal data is there is a set of data. Part of that data is personal data. Part of that personal data is one which is covered under the DPDPA. Part of personal data may not be covered under DPDPA because they may be GDPR data, they may be some other country's data, they may be exempted or whatever is that. Therefore, we are looking at that set of data which is generated from within India, which contains the elements which can identify a data principle as DPDPA protected personal data or DPD. Now, an organization processes DPD through several of its activities. Now, the first principle of DGPSI is, instead of considering the enterprise as a whole and say that we have these multiple processes in DPDPA, DPD processing, and we need a consent for the entire process and so on, we are saying that the process it should become an individual process should become the focus of compliance, so that the entire set of processes which an organization adopts at different points of time for different purposes is broken into purpose-wise technology process, and each such a process is considered as a unit for compliance, and we look at that technology process from the point of view of what is the purpose for which DPD is being processed in this particular set of activities. Where is the consent? Where is the legal exemption? Or is there any legal basis out of legitimate use argument? What happens when the security of this process is to be assessed? So, and so on. That is, the entire DPDA requirements are applied to this single technology process where there is a input of data elements, generation of personal data, or the input itself is personal data, and then it is being modified through the process itself, and then it is given out as an output in a different form of personal data. There could be also certain processes where the input is personal data, output is non-personal data. That is when you have an anonymization process itself as a technology process. So whatever may be the process, where personal data is involved, we look at that as a unit and try to look at the compliance of DPDPA within that. This is the first principle of the DGPSI. In fact, this is the essence which actually makes it possible for us to look at DGPSI-AI as a AI process specific set of implementations, so that an organization which is doing a processing of personal data using an AI process can adopt both the DGPSI, the parent versions, and the DGPSI-AI. Now, this means this is, in fact, this principle is closely aligned with the principle of ROPA, which we normally discuss under GDPR, so that an organization needs to actually identify a series of processes, create a register of processes, and that register under DGPSI will have a process owner, it will have a purpose, it will have a data minimization requirements, it will have a data retention minimization requirements, and data disclosure requirements, and so on. And that process will have a process ID. Okay. And the access to that is only to such of those members of the workforce who need to be involved in this particular process. So which means that data access requirements is dictated by the process requirements. And if the personal data consists of multiple data elements, only such data elements which are required for a given process are considered as essential or for the particular process, and this process will have access only to those kind of data elements within a data set. This requires that data storage is maintained in such a manner that the data elements are flagged together based on for which process it is required. So this is a very deeply thought principle which can actually address a lot of issues which are hurdle in DPDPA. In fact, there are instances where some processes process sensitive personal data, some may not. Sometimes an organization processes data on its own, determining the purpose and the means, therefore it is a data fiduciary. But sometimes it also executes a process on behalf of another data fiduciary without taking any kind of involvement in determining the means and without determining the involving in the purpose determination, in which it only takes care of either the means, or even sometimes the means also is determined by the other data fiduciary, and we act only as a process specialist. So in such cases, an organization may, in some processes, may be a data fiduciary. In some processes, it may be a joint data fiduciary. In some processes, it may be a significant data fiduciary. And in some processes, it may be simply a data processor working on a contractual processing system. Now, if you don't have this process-based approach to compliance, you are going to have a problem, because the entire enterprise, you don't know whether I am a significant data fiduciary or not. Whereas when you break it up into processes, you can clearly demarcate the controls for each process commensurate with what is required. So as a data fiduciary, you are a trustee and you are guided by the DPDPA. As a processor, you are guided by the contract with the data fiduciary. So the original document with which you define controls is different if you are a data fiduciary and data processor. Now, this can be taken into account if you are looking at process as the focus, and that is why this principle becomes very, very significant. Now, the second principle, which is very important, is the classification. Now, when you do classification of data, normally we used to classify data from the security perspective, like say confidential, say secretive, or public, or something of that nature. But when it comes to DPDPA compliance, classification has to support the compliance requirement. Now, compliance is different for different classes of personal data. For example, if it is a minor's personal data, obviously controls will have to be different. If it is a data processed under legitimate use, it is different. If it is based on consent, it is different. And consent itself may be multiple. So in some consent, some permissions are available. In another consent, some permissions are not available. So there are lots of issues which we have to take into account when we comply with DPDPA. And if classification has to support the compliance, then classification cannot be very broad, saying confidential, public, employees only, or something like that. The classification has to closely align itself with the requirements of DPDPA, and that is the principle which we adopt in DGPSI, so that each section which says this type of data requires this type of legal prescription becomes a class of data for us under DGPSI. Therefore, there are actually 31 classifications which we use in DGPSI, starting from non-personal data as one classification, personal data as another classification, within personal data, the various other classes, which details of which we can see when we discuss the implementation specifications. Now, the third principle is to recognize that an organization is always considered as a hybrid entity. Therefore, some of its processes are significant data fiduciary processes, some are not. So when the law says that if you are a significant data fiduciary, you need to have a DPO, you need to have DPIA, you need to have a data audit. Those things are relevant in the significant data fiduciary principle. Therefore, if we have a process-wise compliance, and some processes are significant data fiduciaries and some processes are not, under this hybrid entity concept, we feel that the company can prioritize the compliance by putting the DPO in control of such processes for which the significant data fiduciary classification applies. The rest of it, accordingly, you can classify those processes and in a way put them lower under the priority chart. This helps in resource allocation of the for compliance in the organization, and also when there is going to be multiple locations where processes are held, some sensitive processing can be put in one particular place where there is a DPO and is also located there. And in other case, perhaps a non-sensitive processing can be held elsewhere. So that is the principle of hybrid entity concept. Fourth principle is the distributed responsibility principle, where we feel that the whole responsibility for DPDPA compliance should not internally be left only to the data protection officer, the designated person, but it should be borne by every individual in the organization who has an independent control on certain sets of personal data. If he is a process owner, then he is the team leader who has control over the data processed, personal data, which is part of the process. And there will be, say, a few workers who will be actually working in that process. Now, each of those workers will independently have access at some points of time. So to that extent, they are the persons who are responsible for data protection, while a personal data is entirely under their control. And process owner, being in control of the process, he is responsible for the DPDPA compliance for the process. This way, internally, we will be able to actually decentralize the compliance and recognize some of these people as internal data controllers or internal data fiduciaries, and those who may not have access to identified personal data because they are processing only, let us say, de-identified personal data or pseudonymized personal data. You can even call them as internal data processors. So again, in terms of prioritization of security controls, you can make suitable distinctions if you are adopting this kind of a policy. Now, the fifth principle is that we should recognize that data has a monetary value, and therefore we know how much of resources we are giving and how the monetary value is changing within the process. A process owner should know that when he picks up a set of data elements, combines it and makes it a personal data, he is converting a 1 rupee raw data into maybe 10 rupees personal data. And when he adds in a process, say, biometrics and Aadhaar data, then he's converting a 10 rupee personal data to a 100 rupee sensitive personal data. Similarly, when he converts a sensitive personal data into an anonymized personal data, maybe he is converting a 100 rupee personal data back to 10 rupees personal data or whatever is that. So this way, each process actually adds value or removes value from the market perspective, though every process has a cost. So if there is a reduction in the value, you can say it is like a cost center for security purpose or something. When you anonymize a personal data, you get benefit because it becomes a non-personal data. Okay, so therefore the cost is justified. At the same time, when you add the value, it is a kind of benefit to the organization. So this sort of concepts will be visible if the organization considers a rupee value for data and takes effort in ensuring visibility of that rupee value, however inaccurate it is in the beginning. The basic cost of any data is, of course, the cost of generation. Okay, once it is generated, that is the basic cost. Then, depending upon the depth of the data, whether it is name only or name plus, etc., 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 the value increases. Then, aging of the data is a very complex thing. Sometimes aging may add value. Sometimes it may actually reduce value, because in personal data domain, the permissions or the consents sometimes are subject to some time limits. And even if there is no specific time limit, the Information Technology Act itself may prescribe that after 1 year you have to renew your consent. So which means that after 1 year or when the consent expires, the personal data cannot be used for the processing for which it was originally collected. Therefore, its utility falls down, therefore, its value gets depreciated. So, if you are having a 10-year-old data, 20-year-old data, the accuracy of the data also is very questionable. Therefore, the value is not the same as current data. A credit card which was issued last month has a current data, whereas a credit card which was issued 10 years back obviously must have expired. Okay, and therefore the possibility of assigning different values to different sets of data based on aging is part of this principle. In fact, this also translates into a principle in the AI scenario, where we say that depending upon the age, the AI learning should take into account a certain element of fading of the value of the data for the purpose of training, so that the algorithm model will give more weightage to the current behavior rather than a behavior which was exhibited by, let us say, an individual in a social media 10 years back. Say somebody has posted 10 years back some opinion on the Twitter, and that determines his profile. Now AI may take that as his profile, but yesterday he has posted something else, he might have changed his view, and AI cannot give equal weightage to both these things. It has to give more value to the current performance or behavior rather than the previous behavior. So this assigning monetary value has that kind of advantages. Then we come to measurability, which means that whatever methods we use for compliance, we should build it in such a manner that we should be able to measure how well we are managing the compliance, and that leads to a measurable score, which we have called as data trust score. So in finding out a data trust score, if the compliance is not properly structured so as to evaluate its inherent value, it becomes difficult to measure. So on the different context, one has to see that this kind of measurability is built into it. To some extent, this may help us in meeting a principle called proportionality in certain privacy discussions, so that a DTS of, say, 30 may be acceptable in certain conditions, whereas a DTS of 60 may be mandatory for some other requirement. So something like that can be worked out if your compliance measures are amenable to measurability. Now, the seventh principle is to recognize that whistleblowers or the critics of the company should be given some kind of recognition, in the sense that critics are the early whistleblowers, and whistleblowing is part of the incident recognition, and incident recognition is part of incident management, and incident management is part of the data breach management system. Therefore, the HR policies of the organization should ensure that whistleblowing is encouraged within the members of the workforce, along with the whistleblower protection. At the same time, also involve external people, including the bug bounty hunters, as part of this whistleblowing, let us say, ecosystem. And sometimes whistleblowing can be generated by an employee of one of our vendors or somebody else. That also has to be taken into account. So this augmented whistleblower kind of concept is one of the things which we recommend as part of the HR policy, as one of the principles of DGPSI. Now, principle number 8 talks of top management responsibilities. See, DPDPA compliance is not DPO and below. We have already included people below DPO under the distributed responsibility area. What about people above DPO, like the board of directors? Now, what this principle suggests is that there has to be involvement of the top management. Of course, it may not be possible for the board to directly involve in every aspect. So therefore, we suggest a governance committee, which is like a subcommittee of the board, in which at least one director is part of the subcommittee, and he becomes the chairperson of that. DPO obviously is there along with the DPO. These other stakeholders like the chief marketing officer, HR person, CISO, they all can be there as members of this subcommittee. We may call it as a governance committee, and it is headed by the chairman, who should be a person in the board, ideally an independent director. This is the principle which we adopt. And whenever there is a gap analysis done, the gap analysis is approved by this top management team. And if they feel that the company has got some risk absorption capacity, and therefore certain compliance measures suggested in the gap analysis may have adverse impact on the marketing of the activity, they may take a decision, consider decision to absorb that risk and adopt a implementation specification, which is slightly diluted from the model implementation specifications. So after a gap analysis, so the model implementation specifications will be converted in the gap approval process to adapted implementation specifications, and that responsibility has to be taken by the top management. Similarly, whenever data breach happens, to identify something as a data breach or not, it should be the top management responsibility. Similarly, when there is a software and you don't know whether the software is to be classified as AI or not AI, then again, the top management has to come in. Therefore, this is the principle that top management has to be involved in all critical decisions of DPDPA and not leave the DPO as if you are the designated person. It is your responsibility to take all decisions. Then we come to the principle which recognizes that the compliance of DPDPA does not start and end with the DPO. Okay. Actually, it starts at the business level when a marketing chief tries to negotiate a particular deal, or an R&D department suggests a certain process. So at the new business acquisition level itself, DPDPA compliance has to be part of the decision making. In terms of pricing, the CFO should be aware that where DPDPA compliance is involved, probably the pricing has to be a little higher. So these are things which has to be ingrained into the business acquisition, pricing, business acceptance, then selection of vendors and processors, buying of hardware and software, and of course the selection of manpower. So this is the principle that the DPDPA compliance is not restricted to the DPO and his team, or say with CISO kind of a thing, but it addresses the rest of the organizational responsibilities also. Principle number 10, documentation is integral to compliance. Because we are talking of legal compliance, anything which is done has to be documented, log records have to be documented, evidence has to be kept, and kept in such a manner that it is available at an appropriate time. For example, under the DPDPA, if it says that consent document has to be preserved for say 7 years, now that is a documentation. Now, it is possible that the consent itself may expire because the consent was given only for say one specific purpose, and that purpose is over after 3 months. But the consent document should be kept for say 7 years. So that way, documentation introduces its own nuances which needs to be kept in mind. Then security, of course, is inherent to any compliance, and under DPDPA also one of the obligations is to protect the personal data, and therefore the normal concepts of CIA are essential, but that has to be augmented with the personal data requirements such as obtaining the consent, data breach reporting, so cross-border transfer restrictions to be respected. These are all things which are beyond CIA. The security of personal data is slightly broader than the security of any other information. That has to be taken into account. The DPDPA rules have suggested that anonymization, pseudonymization, and tokenization are to be used where required for security purposes. The last of the principles is motivation of people is fundamental to any policy implementation. So we should never neglect that. It is not technology which drives a company. It is the people who drive the company. And people use technology. People use the policies. Therefore, we formulate policies. We give them appropriate tools to manage those policies. We give them the training, but we still have to motivate them to adopt the policy with the available security tools. And if necessary, we have to have sanctions if they don't follow the guidelines. And at the same time, you can even reward them also. So this entire motivating chain has to be built into the DPDPA compliance. And that is the success of any compliance program. Now, as we enter into the AI agentic domain, tomorrow we are going to have non-human humans actually controlling multiple processes. But under the DGPSI-AI principle, which we are separately going to discuss, we always insist that there has to be a human handler for every AI, so that there will be people even behind the AI agents, and they will be responsible for the work of the AI agent, and therefore this motivation principle continues. And of course, you can even extend it as motivation of the AI agentic force itself. Okay, I think these are the key principles of DGPSI which I wanted to share with you today. And in future discussions, we will try to expand this in terms of say implementation specifications. Thank you.